Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek throughout woodlands and rural villages following nothing but a map and compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. I was out of shape at the time, so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight, which is what I would need to do during the real thing, but we hiked 10 miles through woods in a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back in the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onwards in silence at this point, until all of a sudden, there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked to be in his late 70s or perhaps early 80s. Very pale, with liver spots dotting his face and a grey and white comb-over to match. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought is that seeing some guy at this age out in the woods in these clothes and in these weather conditions is that this guy has certainly lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice though that puzzled me. He was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked as seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He began flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, and that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After a minute he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him and continued following the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down at the slope. It was probably a 40-degree angle and spanned for at least 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross it so quickly and cleanly. I mean, at that distance it's hard to see any fine detail clearly at all. But I swear he didn't appear wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge, and was going to try and make my way down, when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. "Something's wrong here," he said under his breath. We took a few steps back from the edge, and at this point the old man at the bottom started to get irate. He began pleading with us to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down at the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services. That professional help would be on its way soon, and they would have all the tools that they needed to help. The old man then got furious and began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right away, or there would be hell to pay. His voice changed drastically at this point. He was now practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out their sockets, his skin gone pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came in, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter-mile or so to the car. All the while, my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possibly mentally ill man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get into our car and await the police so that we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them, and a pack of supplies like first aid and emergency blankets. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through the bushes, and the search lasted a weekend, but there was never any trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. This has been one of my weirdest experiences to date.
It's been a month since my best friend Tyler disappeared, without a trace. Nobody's seen him since, and as every day passes, his family becomes more and more convinced that their son will never come home. Of course, I'm relatively sad as well, but he'd slept with my girlfriend. We made up, but our friendship was just never the same. But when he vanished, I was the first to look for him. I organized massive searches, put up flyers, and even spoke on television, urging anyone to come forward with information. We were finally relieved when we found a note. The note read, "Hey guys, I know it's sudden, but I'm going on a journey of self-improvement, so there's nothing to worry about. I hope you guys aren't mad, and I hope you understand. X, Tyler." I still miss him regardless, but it's good to know that he's still out there, enjoying life, I think. One particular day, I went to the shower as soon as I came back from school. However, nothing would ease the pounding headache I had, so I decided to take a walk to soothe myself, to recompose, and just take in the sights for a second. I opened the door and stepped outside. My favorite place to go was the local woods, where Tyler and I would spend our younger days, fighting off space aliens or holding cowboy duels. Back then, when times were simple, the world was like our playground. We would play all day long without a care. For about 5 minutes, I followed the worn path while the wind was picking up intensity. I took a sharp left and went down a hill, almost stumbling a couple of times. But the headache seemed to feel less angry and less painful. I eventually came across a hole in the ground and sat down next to it. Nearby, a shovel was stabbed into the ground. "You know you didn't have to make me do this," I said, taking out a lighter. I perched a cigarette on the edge of my mouth.
"I made you do this?"
"Yeah, you did."
"But why? Are you f***ing serious? You know what you did!"
I struck a spark, cupping a hand over the cigarette and lighting it. For a while, we were silent. "I trusted you." I looked down into the hole. A skeleton was all that was left of my best friend, a fistful of maggots feasting away at the flesh that remained. The stench was awful, but I was feeling fine. In fact, better than before. My headache was replaced by a clear-headed clarity. "Wipe yourself off, dude."
Oh wait, you're dead.
I stopped and stood back up, throwing the cigarette into the hole. I picked up the shovel and began to cover up Tyler. I still remember the last words on his lips.
"Please, no, don't do it. please.
I made my way home, through the twisting branches, a plan formulating in my head. I opened the basement door to find my girlfriend waiting for me, her eyes shifting. She's been acting a little weird recently. I feel like she knows. The plan has become clear now. One more hole in the woods wouldn't hurt, right? I lived in a small town when I was a kid. When I say small, I really do mean small. Only around 40 houses in a small crisscross of streets down a couple of miles from Boston. But we were one happy community. Parents could trust their neighbors to babysit their children for a weekend, mow their lawns, and low on sugar? Don't worry, Carla has some next door. Out of all the kids in the suburb, I had a great friend called Timmy. As Halloween began to roll over, Timmy and I began to work on our costumes. Him a ghost, and me a vampire. Our parents a couple of feet away began talking in hushed whispers. After a while, they came over and told us that a couple of children from the area had gone missing. We were naive little kids and would ask dumb stuff like how they just disappeared like that, or if they had invisibility powers. They simply told us to come straight home after school and to never go to house number 40 or talk to Mr. Odd. We called him Mr. Odd simply because we didn't know his real name, and well, because he was odd. He seemed to have never taken a shower and wore the same old drab trench coat with droopy hair and bloodshot eyes that caved into you. The moment the children went missing, Mr. Odd was put to blame. The police were called, and us children watched from the pavement as they busted down his door. Unlike the other houses, number 40 had become uncared for and ancient, crumbling and cracked. It was at the end of the street, this outcast, just like its owner. After a few hours, the police left, having found nothing. But still, the parents of the town kept a watchful eye on the house, and as Halloween finally came by, they released their children carefully into the streets. Before I left, my parents told me to stay overnight at Timmy's place. They had urgent work in the city to attend to, and thought it was safer if I stayed with their family. I was ecstatic about it, and raced outside to meet him. Timmy and I had a method to dry the town of all its sweets. We would start from number 1, and then work our way down. Then, we would come back without our costumes, and see if we could squeeze out any more from these neighbors we knew so well. The one we knew best was Ian. We bumped into him as we began making our way up to our first house. He smiled and waved at us. Timmy caught a glimpse of a purple bracelet on his wrist and asked about it. Ian's smile disappeared into a depressed look. It belonged to Sarah. We apologized to Ian and hurried along our way. Ian's daughter had been one of the missing children, and the topic darkened the mood. Regardless, we made easy pickings of the houses, until eventually, there we were, standing in front of house number 40. I don't remember which one of us came up with the idea of asking there, but determined to not chicken out in front of my friend, I knocked quietly. When there was no answer, I was prepared to spin and bolt, when the door creaked open ever so slightly. Mr. Odd, a ball in hand, held out towards us, full to the brim. Nodding without even saying the traditional line, I only took one, being careful to not look up at his face. Turning around, I began making my way down the steps, when a hand clamped down painfully on my arm. In a raspy voice,
Be careful out there. A lot of kids going missing, you know.
And that was it. Screaming, I pulled out of his grasp and ran down the street. It was only after a while did I stop, catching my breath. Composing myself, I expected to see Timmy, but no, there was nobody. Panicking, I looked around, desperately trying to see him. Suddenly, a figure appeared from behind. It was Ian. "Hey kid, what's the matter?" I tried telling him what had happened, but it all came out in stammers and gasps. "Calm down, it's safer inside, come on." I entered his house, still looking down the street, expecting to see Timmy at any moment. Sitting me down on his couch, Ian disappeared into the kitchen for a while. He came back with a mug of hot cocoa in hand and set it down on the table. "Drink up, kid. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'll go call the police. Sit tight." As he left, I saw a glimpse of a pistol in his other hand, but I felt safe knowing that Ian was here with me. Not a second later, there was a crash in the kitchen. Shouts of struggles, a bang, and then silence. The blood drained from my face, and I instinctively rushed to the door. Turning the knob, I began screaming as I realized it was locked. The world became drowsy around me, my vision unclear. Sprinting into another room, bumping into things along the way, I opened another door only to stumble downwards. I was in the basement and fumbled along the wall, hoping to find a light. I eventually found a switch, flicking it on, and the sight before me curdled my stomach. Piles of corpses stacked upon one another. Some faces were familiar to me, like Patty Grangerson from school, or Danny Lewis, who played on the same football team as me. I vomited when I saw Sarah. The last body was Timmy. His throat had been opened up to a sickly red smile, his ghost costume streaked with blood. The last thing I saw was Mr. Odd, looking down at me with a puzzled look. Then, nothingness. I woke up the next morning to sirens and flashing lights. My parents were there on either side of me, as I lay in an ambulance, hoping that it was all just a dream. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Ian's house was searched, and they found all of the missing children in there. Well, most of them. A few of them were missing body parts. A psychopath had been living across my street, and I never realized it. And I never saw Timmy's parents again. Whenever I would ask my parents, they would just sigh and shake their heads. Mr. Odd still lives down the road. He doesn't bother nobody, and nobody bothers him. But every time I remember Sarah's bracelet, or the last moments I saw Timmy, I can't help but cry in delight. Yeah, you heard me right? I mean, who else could have helped Ian?
I was a fresh-faced graduate from high school. The summer before I left for UT, I took a construction job. I had a full scholarship for my first 2 years, but having a full wallet would help pay for the small things. Most of the other guys were friendly and entertaining. A day didn't pass where we weren't doubled over in laughter because of something someone did or said. 2 of the guys were exceptionally funny. Mark and Daniel had been working on separate sites or together for the past 15 years. They were both grade A practical jokers, but sometimes Mark would take things a little too far. Daniel was more than often the target of his humor. This would become a source of tension between the two, but they always made up by the end of the workday. As you may expect, eventually Mark's joking would go too far for Daniel to overlook. That day just happened to be on my final week on the job. For some time, everyone on the site had noticed Daniel wasn't himself. He spent long periods of time somewhere talking on his phone. When he wasn't gone, he seemed constantly agitated. His usual happy-go-lucky manner had disappeared. We'd all tried our best to make him laugh, but nothing had worked. Not even Mark could do it. As time went on, we all began to believe his troubles were about his girlfriend. When Mark heard about this, he couldn't stop himself from poking at the sore spot. On this day, Daniel had gone on the phone, and when he came back, Mark started joking around. "What's wrong, Danny boy? Are you having troubles at home? Is your old lady getting the bone from the mailman?" The verbal jabs only served to annoy Daniel even further. He said nothing. Instead, he just stared at Mark like he was going to burn through him with his eyes. Mark wasn't going to let his bad mood get in the way of getting a laugh. After lunch and throughout the rest of the day, Mark continued on with his jokes. Daniel, a guy who usually said something when he was fed up, held his tongue the whole day. I knew if he didn't put a stop to Mark's poking, He would take things too far and cause a problem, maybe even a fight, I thought. Daniel was clearly not in any mood to let the remarks roll off his back. And as quitting time arrived, I relaxed. I was almost sure Mark would let up. Unfortunately, things only got worse. A lot worse. It was quitting time. We were going around the site picking up our tools and cleaning any trash we'd left behind. Everyone was focused on the task at hand. I was off in my own little world, thinking about any last-minute things I needed to do before I left for school. When everything was complete, we were all standing around discussing our plans for the forthcoming weekend. It had been a while since Mark had made any jokes, and I assumed he'd stop for the day. When his turn came, he looked very serious and said, "Well, I think since old Danny's going fishing, I'll go over to his place and give his old lady some boning." The joke had come by complete surprise to all of us, and we all fell over ourselves laughing. All but Daniel, of course. I saw a snarl appear across his face. His teeth were gritted so tightly it looked like they'd crumble any second.
"I'm so sick of your stupid jokes."
No sooner had he said this, Daniel stepped forward with his hammer drawn back. I was precariously close to Mark at the time. I stumbled back so quickly I fell onto my butt. I looked up just as Daniel brought the claw end of the hammer into Mark's skull. Mark immediately fell over seizing. Writhing around on the floor, I was in shock, and I froze where I was. I watched Daniel for his next move. He stood over Mark's convulsing body for a moment, surveying his handiwork, I suppose. I was relieved when he calmly walked over to a bench and just sat down. I don't think I could have moved had he come at me. Just like me, the other guys were frozen in place watching as Mark's body slowly came to a limp halt. And we all looked at each other, too terrified to speak. Daniel broke the silence for us. I guess y'all should call the cops. I'm not gonna run off or anything, I'm just a little fed up. The resignation in his voice showed just how far gone he was. The old Daniel I knew wouldn't have done anything like this. We did like he asked, and he didn't give the cops any trouble when it came time to take him away. I thought the shock was affecting me at that moment, but even now, I don't feel anything but sorry for Daniel. It would come out later just how bad things had been going on at home. His girlfriend at the time had cheated on him more than once. She had blamed it all on him, and he had been working 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to keep her happy and keep up with expenses. He was neck deep in love and too blind to realize what was happening until it already had happened. After all he did to give her what she wanted, she had the nerve to complain about him being gone so much. When he was at work, all he could think about was, is she with another guy right now? He was too private to share any of this with us. I don't think Mark had any idea what was truly occurring. He took a shot, and when he saw that he'd hit a nerve, he rode it into the ground. And he did that a lot, and I suppose this turned out to be one too many. I'm sometimes still in shock when I sit back and think about how quickly his life left his body, even in those last few convulsing moments.
I had just moved out of a share house in the suburbs and into my own crappy 1-bedroom apartment in the city. I am a male, and at the time was around 25 years old. My apartment, while old and small, was located about 500 meters from one of the most popular night spots in the inner city. As I was in my mid-20s and out on my own, this was the perfect place for me. This was because my friends and I were quite social and would frequent bars and nightclubs in the city, and the taxi fares were starting to add up. Also, this new apartment was close to my work, so the move made sense. I got settled in right away and invited my friends over for pre-drinks before hitting the clubs. Due to the limited space in the apartment, this means that some friends were inside and some were drinking on the walkway just out front. We had the music up and had just started drinking, but between songs I could hear the couple next door arguing. Now the apartment was old and crappy, which meant thin walls as well, so I pressed an ear to the wall in order to listen. I hadn't met any of my new neighbors at the time, as I didn't take too long in moving in, and I didn't see anyone during. I was curious. Judging from what I could determine while eavesdropping, there were a gay couple in their early 30s. One of the men was yelling at the other to go next door and tell us to keep it down. The other was arguing that it was just a housewarming and to let it go for the night. Since I didn't want to cause too much trouble, I marshaled everyone outside to start making our way to the club, leaving my new neighbors in peace. Later that night, I came home alone as I was tired from the move and decided to let my friends carry on partying without me. I arrived at my door and proceeded to fumble around for my keys, when I looked up to see a man standing on the walkway in front of the next door apartment smoking a cigarette. He was tall and thin with brown, oily hair. I noticed that he had a cut lip and a faded but still visible black eye. "Good day," I said. "Sorry about the noise earlier," correctly assuming he was my neighbor. He replied, "Nah, you're right, mate. I'm Chris," and he shook my hand. I noticed his knuckles were red and a little bit scratched up, so I knew something was off. I apologized for the noise and said, "I hope I didn't cause any trouble for you." He withdrew his hand with a soft but cracking voice and said, "Nah, it's all right. Rick just gets a bit cranky sometimes, I'm used to it." With that, I finished off the conversation and told Chris that I'd see him later. It was about 2 a.m. at this point, and I just wanted to sleep, but couldn't help worrying about the potential domestic abuse going on next door. I decided to keep an eye on it for now, as I didn't have all the info. For all I knew, he could have gotten into a fight with someone else. As the weeks passed, I noticed that my new neighbors got drunk regularly and would argue almost every time. I could tell that Rick was the dominant one, as his voice was a lot deeper and Chris seemed to be afraid of him during their shouting matches. This is why I kept my distance and never really socialized with them. I would even overhear them arguing about me, and that Rick thought that Chris liked me, etc. I would just tune out all of this with headphones and video games, not to mention an active social life and full-time work to keep me occupied. I did find myself avoiding having guests over because of the neighbors. I would opt to meet people out, as their arguments would be quite upsetting. This was working out fine enough until Christmas Eve that year. I was arriving home after having come from some last-minute Christmas shopping. I was getting ready for a night of present wrapping as I was to visit my family the following day for Christmas. As I arrived home, I noticed 2 police cars outside and Anna, an Asian woman who lived a few apartments up from Chris, screaming. I asked her what happened, and all she said was,
"It's just so sad,"
while sobbing. I could see 3 officers trying to restrain someone, and there was blood on their uniform. I came just a little bit closer to see Chris's oily brown hair in the center of the affray. His face was bleeding from his jaw where he had apparently been slashed by something sharp. They got him to his feet, and I could see that his cheek had been cut so deep the skin was flapping open as he struggled and resisted with the police. I recoiled in shock, and I went to comfort Anna, who was crying uncontrollably at this point. Suddenly, Rick's voice boomed out of nowhere.
"You see what you've done? You loser, just kill yourself!"
This frightened me, and my instinct was to get me and Anna to safety. Even though the cops were here, they had their hands full with Chris, and I certainly didn't want to get involved in such an ugly fight where knives were involved. Anna refused to come with me and said she would be fine. I looked around to see where Rick was, and he kept yelling at Chris the whole time. The 3 cops struggled to restrain him, and I could hear Chris whimpering apologetically in between. I couldn't see where Rick was, so I decided to just go to my apartment and lock the door. As I turned to go, I froze, as Rick's voice boomed.
Where'd you think you're going?
A chill went down my spine as my brain struggled to reconcile the fact that these words were coming from Chris's mouth. I felt panic grip me as I realized that all this time Rick and Chris were the same person. All the fighting, laughing, drinking, and carry on that I couldn't help overhearing the last couple of months had come from one solitary person. A lonely guy in his small one-bedroom apartment. For some reason, this made me feel sick. I later learned from Anna that this wasn't the first time the police had come out to take Chris away. Anna explained that he spent a few months at the local psychiatric hospital each time. His father owned the apartment, so it was here waiting for him when he got out. I moved out a few months later, and while it's a sad situation for Chris, I really do feel for him. This happened a long time ago. I'm guessing back in 2006. I couldn't have been older than 4 at the time. Yet I vividly remember the fear I felt during this encounter. It was an early summer morning, and the sun was coming up. But few people were out. In fact, the streets were practically dead that morning. My mum decided to take my sister, a 1-year-old, seated in a stroller, and I to throw away some garbage at the garbage station. I might add that the garbage station is kind of secluded from nearby houses, bordering one of those deep, dark forests of eastern Sweden. Since I was only 4 when this happened, the memories from the incident have faded a lot. However, my mum remembers it all. She says that upon entering the garbage station, she immediately got an eerie feeling of being watched. I remember feeling it too. I felt creeped out, even though I didn't know why I was scared. I guess I could just sense my mum's fear. Walking along the secluded garbage station, my mum suddenly stopped and told me this: "Hold onto the stroller as hard as you can, and don't let go no matter what." That is my most vivid memory I have of this, and I don't think I'll ever forget those words. I'll at least never forget how they made me feel. It was as if my blood turned to ice. I just froze. My mum sounded stern, but even a toddler can sense when someone's scared shitless. My mum was definitely afraid of something. The rest is just a blur. I don't remember much, apart from the aforementioned. So I'll let the rest of the story be told from the perspective of my mother. This is the recollection of her experience, recalled to the best of my abilities but in my own words. Not far from where we were standing, a truck was parked with a man seated in the front. There was nothing unusual. A lot of truck drivers stopped to rest by the side of the road. But this man was staring. He wouldn't stop staring. He stared right at me, examining my body, with the determined gaze of a predator. Gluing the 3 of us in his sight, he truly seemed pleased by the fear he'd instilled in our faces. And his eyes, they were something else. Almost as if they didn't belong to a human, but rather a predator of the savannah. I felt like prey, stuck in the claws of a lion. I just couldn't move. That's when he smiled at me. I remember that smile, dead, cold, calculating eyes to go along with it, and the way he licked his lips, almost as if to say, "I could kill you if I wanted to." I believe this was the point in time, into the strange encounter, when my mum told me to hold onto the stroller, tightly, and not let go. My mum is a small woman, standing at 160 centimeters and weighing barely 45 kilos, and could easily have been overpowered by the overweight man in the truck. My mum later admitted she was afraid he would jump out and knock her out, possibly assaulting her, or even kidnapping me or my 1-year-old sister. We bolted out of there. We didn't throw away much garbage that morning. We just turned around and walked home as quickly as we could, as a mum can with a stroller and a 4-year-old and toddler. We never spoke about what happened that day up until very recently. This incident lingered somewhere in the back of my mind as that weird thing that happened when I was a child, and every time I walk past that garbage station I get a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. As previously mentioned, this happened around 2006. Fast forward to 2008. The face of a 10-year-old girl called Engla was printed across the front page of every newspaper in sight. She had been abducted, sexually assaulted and murdered. And the perpetrator was an overweight truck driver by the name of Anders Elkland, now known as one of Sweden's most infamous killers. Anders Elkland was charged with the murder of Engla, alongside the rape and murder of a woman called Pernilla. He was also suspected of abducting another little girl who's still missing, making him a paedophile, a serial rapist, and serial killer. My mum says that when she saw Elkland's picture in the paper, especially when she saw those cold, familiar eyes, she knew he was the creepy man from the garbage station that early morning, all those years ago. Thinking how my mum, or my sister, or me, all of us could have been his victims, sends chills up my spine. Anders, even though you're behind bars, let's never meet again.
The three boys gathered on the sidewalk. It was almost midnight. They went to the Halloween parade and continued having fun while plotting to scare others. On the sidewalk, there was the front of a hospital. The three of them stood under the morgue window. However, the window was at a considerable height, but there was a tree which they planned to climb up to look inside. Gerardo saw a lady turn a corner and walk towards them. "People are coming," he warned the others, and immediately looked away. "We have to wait for it to happen," said another of the boys. The lady was crossing slowly. Then she seemed to remember. She looked at the window and quickened her pace. In the city, almost everyone had heard some frightening story about that window. Mainly, it was said that some apparitions were observed from there by people passing by on the sidewalk. It was also said that a scary voice called people by their name and laughed. The lady entered the other block. Seeing that the street was deserted, they made up their minds. "Who goes up first?" asked one of them. "Me," said Gerardo. He looked at the tree, lifted a foot to a low branch, and began to climb. The others watched him, turned to the end of the street and looked at each other, trying to guess the degree of fear each felt. Gerardo reached window level. He then gripped the window with both of his arms. With his feet, he braced on a branch that trembled under his weight. Then, he looked towards the morgue. The first thing he saw was the autopsy table, which was empty. Next to it were 4 gurney tables, and on one of them, covered with a sheet, was a body. Gerardo was looking at it, when suddenly the body straightened up to sit. He then pulled the sheet off with his hands, and Gerardo saw that the dead man looked just like him, and the dead man looked at him and pointed. Gerardo shuddered so much that his feet slipped, and when he let go of the trunk, he fell to the ground and hit his head, dying on the spot. An hour and a half later, Gerardo was inside the morgue, and they put him on that very table. Someone pretended to be my father and tried to break into our house. A little context. My dad and I live together in our own multi-family home in Germany. My dad has a serious lung condition. His lungs produce and trap an excessive amount of mucus. The trapped amount is huge and keeps his lungs from working correctly. It's pretty normal that he has to be picked up by an ambulance every 2 to 3 weeks because he can't breathe anymore. Last week, it was that time of the month. He couldn't breathe, so I called an ambulance. Soon, he was taken to the closest hospital. Pretty normal for me, because this happened at least 10 times in the last 6 months. So I went to bed after he got picked up on Tuesday. I went to work the next morning and got a text from him that he had to stay for at least 2 more days, approximately until Friday. On Wednesday evening, I got home from work and played a match of Rogue Company when someone suddenly rang the doorbell. That's unusual because we never have unannounced visitors. I walked to the door and was about to press the door buzzer to open the main door when I heard more than one voice directly in front of my door. That meant that someone just got past the main door. Weird. I asked in German, "Hello? Who is it?" Silence for 3 seconds. Then a person who sounded like my father answered,
Mitcha, it's me. I forgot my keys. Open the door.
I thought, okay, in that case. Wait a minute. My dad never calls me Mitcha, only Mitchy, and there was that sarcastic tone in that voice. I didn't trust the situation, so I called my father on his phone. If the person at the front door was my father, his phone should ring, right? Right, it didn't. Big whoop. My father answered, and as I suspected, he was still in the hospital. Meanwhile, the 2 people on the other side of the door heard my phone call and started kicking my door.
Let me in, Mitcha. It's your daddy. Let me in.
Thank God that door is reinforced. After I threatened them with calling police and having a big-ass knife in my hand, they left. I heard their footsteps running down the staircase. I rushed to a window facing in the street to check if I could see a car or a license plate. Nothing. Just a few footsteps in the distance. They never came back after that. What's weird is that they knew my name and that my father wasn't home, despite his car standing in the driveway. Shit was hitting the fan when a buddy reported something similar. We called the police. Investigation in progress.